West Asia has been on a tinderbox since Hamas's horrific attack on Israeli civilians on October 7th last year. And now with Iranian proxies killing 3 US soldiers in a drone strike in Jordan, another red line has been crossed. Will the war in West Asia enter a third conflict zone? I'm joined in the studio today by Mr. Jason F. Isaacson of the American Jewish Committee and Dr. Premanand Mishra. Gentlemen, welcome to the News9 Plus Show.
Thank you very much, Sandeep. I'm glad to be here.
Thanks for coming. Jason, even as we speak, we're getting reports of major US movements in the skies over Europe, and President Biden has said that the US will respond to that attack on US service personnel. Is the US prepared to enter another conflict in West Asia?
It's very clear the United States does not want to widen this conflict, but it's Iran that is widening the conflict, that is escalating this conflict. The United States has no choice but to respond forcefully to an attack on its soldiers, obviously spurred by Iran, by its proxies in that region, which Iran has been doing for months through various proxies, through the Houthis in Yemen, through Hezbollah in Lebanon, through other militias that they have in Iraq and Syria, firing missiles into Kurdistan. And it's intolerable. An attack on American forces, which have been, I think, some 150 attacks in the course of the last several months. This is the first time that American lives have been lost in that kind of attack.
Right.
But the United States will definitely respond. Right. But it will respond in a way, as the President said, at the time and place of America's choosing, in a way that is not designed to expand the conflict, but to deter further attacks on American forces.
And send out a strong message.
And to demonstrate that the United States is not going to take this lying down, as we cannot, as no country can.
Absolutely. Dr. Mishra, I want to bring you in on this. The fact that the US has said that it's going to retaliate, and it will, because I mean that the red line has been crossed there with US soldiers being killed in action. But how does this complicate the situation, given the fact that you have peace talks in Paris for the release of hostages in the Israel-Hamas war?
Thanks for having me. I think one of the important aspects is that why this particular incident has really happened now. If you see since the 7th of October, Iran is like in everywhere. I mean, it is somewhere that is strategic depth, is like through proxies, through in terms of creating a situation where that no peace process can really happen without involving Iran. And also at the same time, it is also testing United States directly. United States is under almost like it's in retreat. I mean, it's perceived as a kind of a declining power. This region is in flux, and it's not just about Israel and Iran, but Iran is basically challenging United States that how it's going to respond, and it's also sending messages to China and Russia that they are also like looking at what type of retaliation that United States will give. And second point is that this is the first time that directly that US military personnel have been killed. And Biden administration is under severe pressure domestically, elections mode. They are under severe stress, but it's also equally possible that whether it's a full-scale war or the kind of a measured war, because that's something is very difficult to predict at this moment, but it is most likely that Biden will definitely do it to safeguard its face also domestically, and also send a message that business as usual is not going to work out. So yeah, it's a message to Iran and a message to everyone. It depends on that whether a relatively declining power has the capacity, like previously, to challenge Iran, and directly or indirectly both.
Absolutely. And do you want to respond to that, Jason?
I would like to, if I would, Professor.
Yes.
It is often said, I've been traveling to that region for decades, that the United States is a declining power. We're withdrawing from the Middle East. We're not withdrawing from the Middle East. There are 35,000 American troops stationed across the Middle East. We have the 5th Fleet based in Bahrain, very substantial military capabilities, the air base in Qatar. American installations across the region. We're not going anywhere. Iran very much wants to drive America out,
yes.
absolutely.
Yes.
And there are always domestic considerations in the United States, how involved we want to be.
Right.
We want to focus on East Asia. Can we spend as much of our resources in this part of the world?
Right.
But there's no question that the United States is committed
yes.
to its allies in the region, to Israel and to its Arab allies as well. And the United States is not going anywhere. And
right.
Iran, with support from Russia, and frankly the complicity of China as well,
yes.
is quite intent on making it difficult for the United States to stay there, but the United States is staying there and in fact is embedding its relationship further
right.
with countries in the region, as you
yes.
know from the discussions that have been taking place with Saudi Arabia.
Well,
where there's a very keen interest on the part of the Saudis to establish a stronger relationship with the United States.
And that's a question I want to ask you a little while later, but Jason, this point about one of the fallouts of the October 7th attacks has been this rising global tide of anti-Semitism. And that's something that you at the American Jewish Committee have been actively involved with in abating that. Give us a perspective of why this is kind of happening and how alarming is it?
It's very alarming, it's very disturbing, and it's not new, but of course there's been a spike, a surge since October 7th. It wasn't more than hours after the massacre
yes.
that took place on October 7th, 1,200 Israelis and others who were slaughtered by Hamas fighters and Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters, before there were already signs of this spiking around the world. People were accusing Israel of genocide and of war crimes before Israel even responded to what happened
right.
on October 7th. Right. This is an instinct on the part of, unfortunately, too many people around the world, and it's an old phenomenon, a very old hatred, as you know. India, of course, uniquely has no history of anti-Semitism, and it's one reason why we celebrate so strongly the Indian tradition of support for, well, the fight against terror, but
yes.
also its long history of friendship with the Jewish people. What motivates people to make these anti-Semitic comments and to carry out anti-Semitic attacks?
Right.
A long history of prejudice,
right.
exploitation through social media of various conspiracy theories. Just a feeling that the idea that Israel is somehow a colonial power,
yes.
occupying land that is not theirs, when in fact Jews have been indigenous to that land for millennia.
Yeah.
All kinds of distortions of history, and an identification with the underdog. You know, when Israel was the underdog before the 1967 war, when Israel was attacked, as it has been repeatedly by its neighbors, people identified with Israel. People from Sweden and elsewhere would
yes.
live in kibbutzim in Israel and identify with the liberal spirit of Israel.
Right.
Then Israel beat back its oppressors who were attacking it, armies from the Arab world. And then suddenly Israel was now powerful, and therefore Israel was less a source of friendship, or rather an object of friendship for
right.
countries around the world. It's a terrible phenomenon that when Israel is the victim, and when Jews are the victim, people sympathize. When Jews somehow fight back against victimhood, right. that somehow they lose that status. So there have been many of these. It's social media issues,
right.
And just
it's being amplified by
long-term
social
prejudice
media.
that's been going on for centuries.
Right, and in fact this, we just observed Holocaust Memorial Day a
yes.
few days ago, the Shoah. Now, it's one of the worst catastrophes ever inflicted on any peoples. But I was just looking at this survey in the US last December, which says that 1 in 5 young Americans believes the Holocaust is a myth. Is this something that's being fueled by social media? How does this come to pass? That such a substantial
Look, as we
percentage?
get farther away from World War II, farther away from the Holocaust,
right.
Memories fade.
Yes.
Holocaust survivors are fewer and far between. People don't have the same level of awareness, even in our own community, although it's actually quite high in our community, but in the general population
right.
And in the international population, the level of awareness is really pathetically poor. It's there hasn't been the level of education,
right.
Of teaching people the lessons, the terrible lessons of the Holocaust, the never again lessons that we have in the United States memorialized with the museum in Washington,
yes.
with museums around the country, and of course in other countries there are also Holocaust memorials and museums. It's important to keep these lessons alive because it doesn't just affect Jews. We're a
right.
tiny minority. It affects
yes.
every human being
right.
should learn the lessons of the Holocaust.
Right.
That you cannot tolerate that kind of hatred,
Right.
because it then grows, it metastasizes, it becomes violent, it becomes, it leads to massacres, and that's
Right.
what we've seen. It leads to genocide. That cannot be tolerated, and so we cannot forget the lessons of the Holocaust.
Yeah, Dr. Mishra, this thing about the Holocaust denials that's been going on. I mean, you're a scholar. You've studied this phenomenon, and it's being amplified by social media as well. Does this have to do a lot with the politics of West Asia right now, which is, Israel versus the Arabs, and supported by Iran? Is that being fueled by the current geopolitics as well?
Yeah, actually, certainly it adds up the value, but it's not just something about the West Asia. I mean, there's a rabid anti-Semitism exists in Europe and across, particularly in France, particularly in other places.
Yeah.
Even in the United States, a lot of events have happened that synagogues were burned, and it's even the popular narrative. And if you say that, particularly quote unquote Muslim world, they don't make a distinction between the Jewish community and the state of Israel. Sometimes partly also we blame to that whatever the ideological apparatus in which that state of Israel functions, sometimes it's also project that there is no distinction between the actions of Israel as a state
Right.
and the community. So it's a kind of not something about West Asia, but it's real, it's rabid, and it happens across. But one thing I want to add on that here, that these events have been used somehow, used as a pretext of anti-Jewish community remarks. There is an action. If you have seen that there was somewhere in Russia, an airport where people were rushing to kill identifying the Jewish people. Right. So it's real, and it will add more. I would say that sometimes some of the countries will use it as a pretext against. They won't make a distinction between any Jewish citizens across anywhere, need not necessarily Israeli. But that's something that I think the world needs to really, that's not acceptable.
Right.
And it's not just about that. It's not about just Israel, but any community for that matter. These sort of racist remarks or sort of racial identification, it's definitely uncivilized, and it needs to be condemned, and with all force if required.
Yeah, very glad to hear what the professor is saying, because I mean there have been physical attacks, as you know. I mean there have been murders of Jews in France and elsewhere in Europe, and in the United States, of course, the Tree of Life Synagogue, all kinds of hate that has been allowed to grow and threaten our tiny minority.
Right.
But frankly, society in general.
Streaming on News9 Plus. News is now content. Subscribe and get free vouchers.